Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. So today we will deal with a very important and topical issue that is the lawfare at sea in East Asia. So lawfare or legal warfare is the fact of misusing legal argument or legal framework to achieve political goals. It is a kind of hybrid form of warfare aiming to change the status quo by force, but without fighting. Lawfare at some point is a way to turn the might into law. In Asia, China has misused the international law of the sea, both in the East and South China Seas. And in the South China Sea in particular, we've seen Beijing asserting its administrative control over several features and areas, and restraining the freedom of navigation in areas it considered as falling under its sovereignty. To back its claims, Beijing refers to historic rights that are incompatible with the universally agreed UN Convention Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. Meanwhile, China recently authorized its Coast Guard to use force, raising concern among its neighbors. So this is a crucial issue for the region, as it is fueling tensions at sea and geostrategic instability. But it has implications beyond Asia, as if the law of the sea is not respected today in the China Seas, it will be threatened tomorrow in the Arctic, the Mediterranean, or elsewhere, to quote our former Defense Minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian. Finally, such practices are weakening the global regime of UNCLOS with huge potential destabilizing effect. That's why we've seen since the end of 2019 a real kind of battle of not verbal taking place at the UN regarding the claims, and especially the Chinese claims in the South China Sea. So this webinar will discuss lawfare practices in the East Asia, their implication, and the way maybe to discourage or counter such practices, both from a European and Asian point of view. And we are very lucky today to have three impressive guest speakers to share their views. First, we have Koji Soloka will provide a Japanese perspective on these questions. He is a former ambassador of Japan to the United Kingdom, and he held several key positions during his own career in the diplomatic service, including as a Japan chief negotiator for the successful Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation. Then Christophe Prazuk, or should I say Admiral Prazuk, will provide his vision, a French vision on the issue. Until last year, he was the Chief of Staff of the French Navy, and he has been recently nominated the Director of the Ocean Institute at the Sorbonne University. Last but not least, Jane Chan will give one Southeast Asian perspective. On this question, Jane Chan is a senior fellow and a coordinator of the Maritime Security Program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. And I must say she is one of the most knowledgeable experts on maritime security issue in Southeast Asia. So I'm very happy to welcome the three speakers this morning. And before we start, I would like to remind a few housekeeping rules. After the initial remarks by the speaker, we will open the discussion part of the webinar and introduce the question from the audience. So if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box of your Zoom window. I will gather them and do my best to make the speaker address them. So now, without further ado, I will give the floor to Ambassador Soloka for his presentation on Japanese perspective on this issue for up to 15 minutes. Ambassador Soloka, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Discussing is not just limited to the issues of freedom of navigation or international law as applied to the sea, but more generally, it is an issue that relates to rule of law. If international law is not respected and observed, then there is no stability, no predictability, and the world will be in a mess. Uh, we were able to come this far since the end of the Second World War, and there is no country that is worse off than uh, comparing where they were in 1945. We have come a long way, and this has been a success because countries collaborated peacefully, negotiating through peaceful means to achieve the common objective of good for the world and the good that will benefit each and every country and each and every people. Now, I have been asked to discuss both East China Sea and South China Sea. Since Japan is on the East China Sea side, I will mainly use my time to discuss East China Sea and then briefly refer to South China Sea. All of you know that the East China Sea is comprised of the sea area as well as some islands in between Japan and the continental China. The issue we have bilaterally with China is what we do not consider that as territorial issue because the Senkak Islands have always been Japanese territory and has been registered according to international law in effect at that time. But the claims that are being made by China has become more and more forceful. Now, if you look at the legal questions that you can find in East China Sea, and this is also related to UNCLOS, which came fairly late, or it is fairly new in the international scene, but it is governing the rules of the sea in a universal and comprehensive manner. So, if you have any legal question, the first document you need to refer to is UNCLOS. Now, the territorial debates is not necessarily what UNCLOS has envisaged as its central objective. But the 200 miles economic zones, exclusive economic zones, or the seabed mining, or continental shelf, these are all new notions that have been introduced by UNCLOS through very lengthy negotiations that included almost all countries in the world existing at the time, inclusive of what we consider to be stakeholders around both East China Sea as well as South China Sea today. So it is different from the norms that have been created centuries ago, and newly independent countries have been not part in their making. UNCLOS is a new convention which is universal and which has had participation from across the globe. This is indeed representative of the universality of United Nations. That's why it's called United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas. Now, the two legal questions that I identify in East China Sea between Japan and China, one is Chinese claim on the Senkak Islands. There's no question that Japan is currently and will also in the future possess sovereignty over the Senkak Islands. It is uninhabited now, but for more than 100 years, and in the meantime has had Japanese factories creating fish cans, and then activities of economic nature has been conducted, although they are no longer commercial feasible and no one lives on the rocks on these islands today. The agreement was reached on the other issues of exploration of seabed resources in the East China Sea between Japan and China in 2008. It's a bit a while ago, but it is really quite new. It's contemporary. And that agreement between the two countries had identified that we will establish, this is related to the delimitation of the continental shelf, a median line between Japan and China, where there may be resources on the seabed. And in fact, China has a rig alongside the median line that was starting to dig in and develop natural resources, oil and natural gas in particular. That agreement also stated that the detailed implementation of the agreement will be subject to a further agreement between the two governments, which will be in the form of legally binding exchange of notes. Unfortunately, that negotiation has not started. It's been more than 10 years, dozen of years has passed, but that agreement has not been implemented, and we are, Japan and myself out of government now, continue to be disappointed that such discussion is not taking place, because if you do not peacefully resolve issues, then there is a unilateral action that a country that has the capability of imposing their will could prevail. In fact, they are continuing to explore and dig in, and there is concern that the resources that could be also on the side of Japan, the median line underneath the sea, could be siphoned out by the rig that the Chinese side has built on the other side. And this was the concern that led to have this agreement between the two sides on 2008, but unfortunately no further discussion has taken place. Now this means there is a difficult issue here that is a combination of the territorial claim on the Senkak Islands by China and the Chinese traditional position on the delimitation of the continental shelf. They are in a position of claiming that continental shelf can be extended beyond 200 nautical miles as a natural extension. Japan does not take that view, where the sea area is within 400 nautical miles. In other words, if there is a distance that can be reached beyond 200 without having another coastal state on the other side, that may be an argument that could be conducted in accordance with UNCLOS. But UNCLOS also states that coastal states have to discuss and negotiate where the continental shelf under their jurisdiction can be located, and Japan takes the median line view. So this is not what the Chinese position finds acceptable, but we have agreed as a provisional measure to allow the exploration to go on while the serious question or sensitive question of delimitation will be discussed further. In other words, the Chinese position has always been consistent in the sense that they are claiming the Senkaku Islands, and they are also claiming the right to explore the extended continental shelf that is inclusive, or let's say Senkaku Islands sits on. So it's a very delicate question of being rather expansionist in extending their rights. In some cases, the word continental shelf, I've heard, only applies to countries that are continental. Japan is an archipelago, is an island country, not a continent. So some people say continental shelf doesn't exist for Japan because we are not continent. Well, that is not what UNCLOS says. So the legality of the issue really have to be debated, and we have been very consistent in pointing out to the provisions of UNCLOS that designates Japan to act in the way we have. In the meantime, there's been two developments that I believe we need to be focusing on. One is the designation of air defense zone around East China Sea. China has designated a fairly large and broad area around East China Sea, inclusive of airspace over the Senkaku Islands, and as well as some parts of Republic of Korea, South Korea, as their air defense zone. Designation of ADZ in itself is not a problem under international law, but how you act and behave with the flights of the ADZ can be a problem. Of course, UNCLOS, as well as existing norms of international law, allows all flights to freely fly over high seas, inclusive of seas over continental shelf or EEZ. But ADZ designed by China includes clauses that say the Chinese authority could interrupt or direct flights that they find problematic to go outside, and if not, take necessary means to force that action. This is a very problematic provision that we see capable of causing conflicts in the physical nature if implemented by China unilaterally. Another source of concern is the new law that has been passed just this year by China, ruling how the Chinese Coast Guard can and or should behave in times they face certain situation. The Coast Guard duty in many countries are a combination of military and policing. But Coast Guard's duties in most cases are governed by police proportionality in terms of permissible actions, because it is a policing act to safeguard your own territory or your own interest. UNCLOS, of course, recognizes the need in contiguous zones that the security, safety, sanitary reason, and health and so forth be safeguarded by the coastal state. These are legitimate demands. It is written in that new law, however, that this applies to undefined, in a way, ambiguous territory, which is called under jurisdiction of China. There are many disputes about where the jurisdiction ends or is legitimate. If a country unilaterally decides where it can exercise its authority, that can be a very threatening move. Another problematic, and there are many problematic provisions in this law, but most typical is the control over official vessels, including warships. UNCLOS also specifically stipulates that warships and official ships are exempt from any coercive action by coastal states. And immunity of government vessels are, of course, a sacrosanct, and it is a well-standing norm of public international law. But this domestic law does not respect it in the fullest extent. If exercised, could be very detrimental. So let me stop here and then respond to questions related to South China Sea when we will go into the discussion mode. Thank you, Céline, and back to you.
Thanks a lot, Ambassador Tsuruoka. I think it was a very good overview of what's going on right now in the East China Sea. And thanks a lot for raising various issues like legal issue, but also the question of the exploitation of for resources, the ADIZ and the recent Chinese law on the Coast Guard. So now we give the floor to Admiral Prezek for his own perspective on what's going on in the China Seas. Thanks a lot.
Merci, Céline. So I will continue in English. And the South China Sea, the scene of maritime and territorial disputes, as you all know. And on this stage, China has adopted an assertive strategy of power. It is also the scene of the questioning of the international law of the sea. It seems to me that there is a paradox in the Chinese strategy, which is simultaneously building a first-rate maritime capacity and at the same time is undermining the law of the sea, the foundations of the freedom of navigation, one of the bases of its unprecedented economic growth. So first, the disputes. Maritime and territorial disputes are intertwined. To better distinguish the issues, I will take the liberty of simplifying the equation by separating the variables. Territorial first, maritime second. In accordance with the customary principle of maritime law, the land dominates the sea. So territorial disputes, they concern the sovereignty over islands, spratlys, paracels, patras, contested by China, Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, Vietnam. These sovereignties give rights over the maritime spaces surrounding the land available for fishing or the exploitation of possible hydrocarbon deposits. In support of its claims, China is pursuing a strategy that indents, one after another, a series of faits accomplis. Its maneuver brings into play a very wide range of means. First, its fishermen, who operate in swarms in the disputed areas. Then, its sea militias, which protect the fishermen. Then, its coast guards, which support them with 130 ships of more than 1,000 tons, and a new law that have been discussed by Ambassador Tsuruoka. And finally, its navy, whose growth in quantity and quality is now challenging the US Navy. These maritime and naval maneuvers are supported by an administrative maneuver, with the creation of new administrative entities in the Paracels and the Spratlys. They are also supported by a wide variety of soft power tools, including a marine environment protection campaign called Blue Sea 2020. But even if these land claims were recognized, along with the maritime rights they give rise to, they would still fall short of another Chinese claim that contains and amplifies it, the so-called Buffalo Tongue or Nan-Dash Line claim, which delimits 80% of the South China Sea. This is the maritime dispute. This claim reverses the basic mechanism of the law of the sea. The universal rule is that the rights to the sea are derived from sovereignty over the land. On the contrary, the Buffalo Tongue is a maritime space in which any land would see its sovereignty deduced from the rights recognized over the waters around it. First introduced in 1949, the Nine-Dash Line has been vigorously revived since 2009. In its argument, China makes no distinction between areas under sovereignty, i.e. internal waters or territorial sea, and areas under jurisdiction, i.e. EEZ. It maintains the vagueness of the right it claims under the formulas of historical Chinese waters, areas of indisputable sovereignty, traditional Chinese fishing zones. These claims were invalidated in July 2016 by an international arbitral tribunal formed at the initiative of the Philippines. The challenge of the Montego Bay Convention also concerned the definition of the baselines that determine the limits of territorial waters. In some places, the Chinese territorial waters can extend up to 122 nautical miles from the coast, instead of the 12 nautical miles of the convention. China also challenges the right of innocent passages of foreign warships through its territorial waters and requires prior notification of military activities in its EEZ. All these requirements are excessive under international maritime law. Are they a test of the famous historical rights that China wishes to impose throughout the maritime territory delimited by the Buffalo Tongue? Two conclusive remarks. The first one on the overall coherence of the Chinese position. Since 2005, China has chosen the open sea. It is making considerable and successful efforts to become a global maritime power. Military, commercial, scientific, port resources. 7 of the 10 largest container ports in the world are in China. Its fishing fleet is unrivaled. Its navy, which until a few years ago was the coastal navy with defensive mission, has become an ocean-going navy, capable of projecting the power of its aircraft carriers and the strength of its amphibious units. It now sails on all the oceans and has its first support base in Djibouti. This development is coherent to support a global commercial influence, to ensure the security of a growing civilian fleet, to protect the world's largest fishing fleet, and to support a huge diaspora that must be evacuated when the situation requires it, as in Libya in 2011. All this requires freedom of movement, the ability to navigate, to move its fleet according to commercial opportunities or strategic needs. This agility, one of the foundations of maritime power, is guaranteed by the International Convention on the Law of the Sea. However, it is the same law, the same right that is now being called into question by the historical vision of the South China Sea, seen as the liquid extension of the continent. There is a contradiction there, clearly assumed. My second remark is about the political cost of this posture. Contradictory or realistic, the Chinese posture mobilizes neighbors who are denied sovereignty, who are denied rule of law, who are denied access to fishing or energy resources, and more distant maritime nations who want to preserve the law of the sea. What prospect of gain can therefore motivate such a delicate posture, the political cost of which is high? Food security, maybe, it is said, produced by the exploitation of fisheries, 5 to 8% of the world's catches, which feed 300 million people in Southeast Asia. Economic gains linked to possible underwater hydrocarbon deposits. Military gains that seem much more hypothetical. In peacetime, some of the fortified outposts contribute to the permanent monitoring of the outgoing flow from Malacca. Similarly, some other posts observe the approaches of the Chinese coast. However, these functions could be performed by a continuous and agile deployment of numerous naval and air assets of the Navy or the Coast Guards. And these fixed posts are extremely vulnerable. Their positions are immovable. They do not benefit from the coverage of a global defense system. This maritime Maginot Line does nothing to control the sanctuary of the deep waters in the northern part of the sea, an area of major importance that allows the safe deployment of strategic submarines. Whatever the reason of these growing tensions, this situation is exemplary, and it may inspire or legitimize other revisions of international norms. These issues of universal nature have called for France's regular, announced, and persistent commitment in this region, and it's a satisfaction to see that other European countries are following our nation. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Admiral, for these very energetic presentations. And I think you were quite successful to try to decipher what's going on there and clarify the differences between the territorial and maritime claims, and also highlight the Chinese contradictions. And also I will come back to you a bit later on the French and European role, of course, regarding all this. Now, Dr. Chan, the floor is yours for a local perspective on what's going on in the South China Sea in particular.
Thank you very much, Céline. A very good day, one and all. A quick word of thanks to the organizers for the invitation, a privilege to join this gathering, to share my thoughts, and to learn from the experts with us today. And indeed, since we are amongst experts, I think there's no need for me to dwell into the background of the maritime challenges in Southeast Asia, nor the genesis of the South China Sea disputes, less the chronology of incidents at sea. So given the limited time that we have, I will take a broader view compared to my fellow panelists, and to review the challenges we have from three main angles. The first, to share my assessment on the development of local tension as prescribed by the theme of this session. Second, I will dwell into the complexity in dealing with the South China Sea problematic, so to speak, as I saw it. And third, to close things off with some thoughts on the code of conduct. So onto the task at hand. First, my assessment on local tensions. We often say that regional maritime environment depends partly on global developments and partly on local ones specific to Southeast Asia. And the reverse is also true. The safety and security of regional waters is important for interests of countries far beyond this region, as it is for our immediate neighbors here in Southeast Asia. So to focus on Southeast Asian priorities and to take Singapore as an example, right? As a small state in more ways than one, Singapore has a fundamental interest in the peaceful settlement of international disputes in accordance with international law and its sanctions processes, rather than on the basis that might is right. And second, as an island state hemmed in by very big neighbors, Singapore relies on international law, including UNCLOS, to preserve freedom of navigation and overflight, and we need to ensure that such laws are interpreted and applied consistently. And third, as a Southeast Asian state, right, Singapore has an interest in ensuring that the association of Southeast Asian nations, ASEAN, remains cohesive and united, and that its processes effectively advance common interests by engendering a high degree of cooperation and integration amongst all its member states. So essentially, an inclusive maritime region founded upon an international rules and norms lays the foundation for safe and secure seas, which is crucial for the region's continued growth and prosperity. But even as friends and partners all emphasize the importance of maintaining a rules-based order, in my view, it is still rather clear that there is no common outlook on what the Southeast Asian maritime future should look like, right? The lack of the common outlook means that there is no alignment of priorities and less so on policy and strategy. So those whose vision is a competitive one will insist that the current strategic environment is a zero-sum game and that this is currently dominated by great power competition and rivalry. So even as extra-regional powers extend their interest to cooperate with Southeast Asia, many are concerned that this could add complexity to ongoing Sino-US rivalry. So challenges to traditional freedoms of the sea arising from territorial and maritime disputes about who owns what, about jurisdiction and obligation of coastal states versus rights and duties of user states, about environmental concerns, and about the lax observation of agreed principles of laws, rules, and regulations. So we do see nation states forgetting that UNCLOS was a product of a grand bargain, one that was forged through difficult compromises which we may not achieve again. So in that vision of the world, we can expect very little cooperation and a rather high risk of fractured regional institution and that of conflict. Conversely, there's also a vision of cooperative nature, reminding us that the success of our nations depends on seaborne trade and the globalized system that it leads to. Still acknowledging that the system is under threat, it is just not because of great power competition. Right, the damaging effects of maritime security threats are well known, right? Piracy, armed robbery, illegal, unreported fishing, so on and so forth. The reason I raise this point of needing a common vision is really to tease out the issue of narratives. Why? Because prima facie, ASEAN and China are using the same narratives, right? Both speaks of the importance of rules and governance, the importance of cooperation, and the important role of regional and international institution plays. But do we mean the same thing? And this is perhaps where we ought to take the time to question what terms like rules and norms building means to ASEAN and to China. What does the new order means or how it should look like? So back to the point of whether we in the region can realistically have a common vision that we are committed to, one that is based on rules that are consistently interpreted and applied, and an order that is universally accepted. So now to zoom the lens closer on the complexity in the South China Sea. The tension in the South China Sea, as mentioned both by Ambassador Koji and the Admiral, is that it is no longer only about the complex competing territorial and maritime disputes between the claimants. Today, the core contention arising from the South China Sea, in my view, is about the broader question on the universality of rules, laws, and regulations where the stakeholders are no longer limited to the claimants alone. Major power competition in the South China Sea drove up tensions, increased frequency of naval enforcement activities, arguably increased the risk of incidents at sea. And these conditions have eroded the much needed atmosphere of trust and amity for resolving regional maritime disputes. And the so-called and ongoing battle of not verbals a while back saw China receiving much more serious pushback from Southeast Asian states, coming both from claimants and non-claimants, as well as extra-regional powers, including US, Japan, Australia, and major European states. All the objecting states referred to UNCLOS and have challenged the legality of China's claim to sovereign rights and jurisdiction in the South China Sea that was based on historic rights or the 9-9. I believe the most important development on the note to note is that we saw Southeast Asian states placing emphasis on the importance of UNCLOS and the arbitral award, stepping out and clearly iterating their positions. And this change of attitude is likely abetted by China's own attitude towards international law and is perceived to be on the path of challenging the current rules-based legal order. But to sidestep this train of thought, and I think it's important to highlight that the effectiveness of UNCLOS is often up for debate in the region, and its provision still a source of contention between state. And this very much, speaks to Ambassador Koji's point, which he alluded to in his presentation. And there are many examples of non-compliance, including the uses and abuses of Strait Baseline, perceived illegal restrictions on freedom of navigation by coastal states, reluctance to acknowledge the rights and duties of user states in the exclusive economic zones. So one could argue that the current tension between US and China have magnified the differences in interpretation and application of international law in the region. And we see tension between the interests of coastal states on the one hand and those of major maritime powers or user states on the other. So if we follow this line of argument, even if China recognizes that it is in its own interest as a rising maritime power to align its position on UNCLOS closer to that of the United States, it may only perpetuate tension between coastal states and major neighbor powers. So the underlying tension arising from the ambiguity and different interpretation of vital provision in UNCLOS remains unresolved. And of course, we can have a totally different seminar on that topic alone. But bottom line today, UNCLOS, a grand bargain no less, reflected, or we want to continue to propagate that it reflected an equitable balance between the interests and jurisdiction of the littorals, big and small, and the navigation rights and obligation of user states, neighbor power or not. And to remind everyone that these carefully negotiated provisions, including the freedom of navigation, must not be arbitrarily curtailed or undermined in contravention of international law. Very quickly to touch on the Code of Conduct of COC in short. The ASEAN-China consultative process on the Code of Conduct has long been criticized as being slow and riddled with diplomatic hold-ups. Now that the consultative process is stalled due to COVID-19 related constraints, it put in questions the sincerity of the negotiating parties and whether the COC is still a serious pursuit. Is ASEAN or the 10 ASEAN member states and China on the same page when it comes to what we want to see in the South China Sea? What are the priorities and how can we get there? And judging from what we hear from within the COC consultative process, it is no secret that the 10 ASEAN member states don't always see eye to eye, and it is clear that China has a very different plan in the South China Sea. So if we are in agreement that on that very basic premise that all parties has a very different agenda, which is only natural and not at all surprising, then what exactly are we hoping to achieve in a COC? I really only have the questions with no good answer at this point. In my mind, whilst there's no illusion that the COC can change behavior overnight, I still believe that it can be useful as a basis for self-restraint by all parties and a good guideline, at the very least, for cooperation and management of risk in regional waters. I'll leave it at that, and I'll look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jane. Very good presentation, and I like the way you refer to the issue of narrative, which is very important at several levels, including regarding the lawfare in South China Sea. And thanks also for the update regarding the code of conduct. And I will later ask you if you're optimistic or not regarding a successful issue for the code of conduct. So now we will move to the discussion part of the webinar. We have already a number of questions flowing in, so that's very good. But you can keep going. I will do my best to gather them, and I will first abuse my position as a chair to ask the three of you maybe three questions. The first one is related to last year, basically, and the pandemics, the COVID-19 pandemics. Have you noticed, have you seen any kind of impact of this pandemics on what's going on in the East and South China Sea? Any change on the Chinese practices? So we understood that China at some point leveled up and its push in the both seas. Have you seen also any implication in terms of the ability and or the willingness of Southeast Asian countries or Japan or outside other countries like France and European countries to actually step in and then push back on China, on Chinese practices, because the pandemics is also impacting the economics, the economies in the region, and maybe at some point is reinforcing the economic dependence vis-a-vis China. So it might make any resistance more difficult. So that would be my first question. My second question. So we talked about what's going on, but I guess this is a difficult question. But what, in your view, would be the best way to try to prevent these practices, or to push back in the most effective way without any backfire or any counterproductive effect? And my third question is related to the European position, and the EU has recently published its strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, and among other things, it's called for a more consistent European naval presence in the region, maybe in the form of a European coordinated presence. And then this year, if you count the UK in, we have actually 3 European naval deployments in the region, and also all the way to the East and South China Sea. So my question would be to Admiral Pratzuk, what is your perspective on the enduring European naval presence in the region? Do you think it is feasible? Do you think it is sustainable? How to do it? And to Ambassador Tsuruoka and Dr. Chen, what are the perspectives from Japan, from Southeast Asia regarding this European naval presence in the region? Is it welcome? What are the expectations, or do you think that kind of diplomatic support would be actually more relevant? So that's my 3 questions for now. So we can start according to the program order. So Ambassador Tsuruoka, would you like to respond?
Thank you, Céline. Well, first, the effect of COVID-19, the corona threat. It has caused huge damage to the lives and well-being of the people around the world. And Asia has not been an exception. Japan is currently under the declaration of emergency. So I could not travel to Paris to join you to do this. And of course, this is not going to go away easily, and we will have to adopt ourselves to how we can make our lives under the COVID-19. Now, so it's a bit of a surprise, and this is something that I think we need to be happy about, is the Chinese success of suppressing it. Europe, US, India now, and Japan as well, is experiencing a number of successive waves of contagion, one after the other. Now we may be entering the 4th major threat derived from different viruses. So that is not seen happening in China, although initially they suffered great damages. It seems that they have succeeded in containing, and we see video footages where people are not even wearing masks in China. This is also reflected in the success of resuming economic activities. The only country of major economies that is growing over the course of this past year. all other countries are recording minus growth, but China alone is continuing to grow. Therefore, of course, a dependence on the Chinese economy will become heavier than was used to be. But that doesn't mean that China will become more important in terms of trading partners to the other countries, because they have always been an important trading partner to start with. There's also discussion about what are the strategic and security consideration you need to take in for the expanding and intensifying supply chain, which is disrupted for various reasons that are detrimental for businesses. So, of course, the COVID crisis is going to affect adversely the economies around the world, including those in Southeast Asia. But I am not singling out that threat as the reason for giving China an upper hand in dealing with issues of either East or South China Sea. That's my answer for the first one. Second, how can we effectively prevent damages caused by the unilateralism that we see? Of course, if we can address it collectively, we can resolve it. But as Jane said, do we have a common objective? If we don't agree on what we could achieve, then it will be a fruitless conversation. And this is really a very important starting point of negotiating anything. Unless you agree that we need to resolve it with equal distribution of benefits to the stakeholders, it is not going to be worthwhile negotiating, because the mighty will use their power. The fait accompli is already abundant. It's unbelievable how many land reclamation had been conducted in the course of the last 6 years or so. It's amazing that the once coral reef, beautiful and environmentally protected, UNCLOS also obligates countries to respect environmental protection, has been dumped with cement, and now we see even long militarily usable airstrips in the middle of the sea. These are fait accomplis that are continuing to be built and imposed by China. There are other countries also that are reclaiming lands. And if we can collectively agree that we need to preserve the nature, environment, as well as the right to access these waters freely and in comfort, perhaps a collective way of addressing it according to UNCLOS and international norms could become meaningful. Unfortunately, today, there is absolutely no basis of trust, because one side continues to take unilateral action and the other is just responding. If I may just be allowed to show one chart that shows very clearly what I'm referring to. Céline, could I? This is the chart that I'd like to show to the audience, and it is the chart that shows the number of intrusions by Chinese vessels into waters around the Senkaku Islands, including territorial sea. Up to 2012, the intrusion was almost non-existent. But from 2012 onward until 2021, we see this surge of the number of ships coming around the Senkaku waters, and the red lines are the ones that have entered Japanese territorial waters within 12 nautical miles of the Senkaku Islands, including those by Chinese official vessel, the Coast Guards and others. So there's no way you can stop it unless they they will agree to go back to 2012 and start discussing things on the basis of normal conditions. So unfortunately, I don't think there is a situation that allows collective discussion leading to any conclusion. Jane discussed the code of conduct. I have also been part of that conversation in many of the IRF and ASEAN dialogues when I was in the office. But I think of how the declaration of ASEAN and China on the situation of South China Sea is not even being looked at. You can draft papers, sign them, but if they are not implemented, what is it worth? There's no use to have new documents. All necessary documents are already there, including UNCLOS, UN Charter, the declaration, and all the, even CAT, the Convention on the Amity, and so forth. But unfortunately, they are not respected. I will not refer to the European position per se, but I could just say very clearly that we welcome the European attention to this region. There's been a number of countries that have been supportive of promoting free and open Indo-Pacific. You could recall that the Chinese spokesman was offended and said Japan and US leaders in issuing the joint declaration were just imposing their will, a small minority of countries, just the two, imposing their will upon others. On the title it says open and free, but in fact enclosing China by the waters. Totally wrong. The idea of Indo-Pacific as a free and open ocean is definitely in line with what UNCLOS has decided to provide the global community with assurance that trade and free navigation will continue to be secured. And what we are trying to say is this is for the benefit of all, including the trade that goes through these waters to destination of China. So they are welcome to join and work with us to do that. So this is a global effort, and the European participation willingly. We've seen many documents, and finally EU has also issued a document in support of this Indo-Pacific initiative, is demonstrating that this initiative is of global value. We welcome very much the deployment of naval forces to the region as a strong commitment to secure the safety of navigation and the safety of the trade that goes beyond the Suez Canal into Indo-Pacific Ocean, and that benefits also the African states because these are trade partners to us. Thank you.
Excellent, Mr. Ambassador. Admiral, would you like to follow up?
Yes, a few words on your questions. First, COVID, it did not prevent the French Navy and French forces to maintain patrols and presence in the Western Pacific. Was there an evolution of the Chinese posture? What we've seen for several years is that this evolution is continuous, and that our frigates, our ships that are patrolling in the South China Sea can observe an evolving position of their counterparts, Chinese counterparts. Radio contact, escorts, more and more presence of the Chinese counterparts. But so far, we have not noticed any provocation in this area, no dangerous or unprofessional posture as we may encounter them in other places. About what can be done. First, there is a French Indo-Pacific strategy because France is a riparian country, both of the Pacific and of the Indian Ocean. And so we have a strategy and we have partners, and we are supporting our partners. Second, as I said, what is happening is in this region is not only a regional dispute, but it has a universal impact. And this is why we are implied. We are implied because of this universal impact. We are implied because we want to protect and defend the rule of law. If we want to protect and defend the rule of law, we have to understand what is going on. And we need to build our autonomy of assessment. Autonomy of assessment is one of our key strategy in France. If we want to have an autonomy of assessment, we need to observe, we need to gather intelligence, we need to exchange, we need to support our allies. This is why 4 to 6 times a year, we, the French Navy, send ships, either sailing from Tahiti or from Noumea or from European France. We send ships to patrol in this area, to work with our allies and partners in this area. At the present time, an amphibious ship, French ship, escorted with a frigate, and an Australian supply ship is heading towards Japan. And they have been crossing through the South China Sea, and they will have a port visit in Japan and then conduct an exercise with the Japanese self-defense force. And we are willing to exchange our assessment, our experience, our data with our European allies, and especially those who have declared that they will send ships in the Western Pacific. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Dr. Chan.
Thank you, Céline. I'll go through some of the questions and then we can have more discussion on that. Your question on the impact of COVID, I think the one thing that I often remind myself is that COVID is not over yet, right? So in that sense, you know, arguably we have not felt the full blown of the impact of COVID on policy changes, or in a way, you know, we have not seen the full effect of potential policy changes within the region because of COVID. So in that sense, you know, the one effect or impact that you were trying to tease out, I would say, is of course, you know, as I mentioned, the stop ASEAN-China consultative process on the code of conduct. But that is really because of practical challenge of not being able to meet physically. It's interesting because, you know, now that we are all doing, you know, virtual meetings, why this track of, you know, consultative process, you know, have not considered using the virtual platform. And of course, you know, we understand that, you know, in a way, you know, it's also, you know, a very Asian, you know, practice of where meetings are to be conducted, you know, face to face. But the other point is one that, you know, Ambassador Koji mentioned is, and it's quite interesting because we all saw the Ifri report in terms of defense spending. And again, you know, I think it's too early to jump to conclusion to question why the spending has increased, because a lot of this data it's you know, pre-COVID, a lot of commitments that, you know, countries have made was pre-COVID. So, you know, we may have to wait a little longer in terms of looking at, you know, the impact of COVID on defense policy and defense strategy. Your second question in terms of what's the best way to counter some of the challenges that we saw in regional waters. And in a way, you know, I believe that looking at Southeast Asian responses, right, especially with the emphasis on, you know, a more collective emphasis in terms of the importance of international law and rules-based order, and coming out of the usual, you know, comfort zone to highlight this fact, you know, is important. And why I say so is because increasingly we are also hearing from within China, right, that they are seeing the arbitral award as problematic now, right? Post 2016, you know, you see the main narrative as, you know, oh, we are just going to ignore it. It's not relevant to China. We are not party to it. Today, you hear a lot more from within China talking about, oh, we are now feeling the negative impact and negative effect of the arbitrary award, extra-regional countries, Southeast Asia, are all mentioning it more now. So in that sense, I believe that, it has had a positive impact in terms of, how we can try to engage China on this. I think rather than, trying to corner them to corner them, which is why, I thought the way that you have raised the question is an important one, is that, how to make sure that we don't get blowback, right? How to make sure that, in engaging China on this issue, we don't get a negative impact on this, and that, engaging China on this process is going to be very important, and to make sure that, the discussion is an inclusive one. A point on European naval presence in regional waters, in Southeast Asian waters and Asian waters. I think the important point, as mentioned by the Admiral, is that, extra-regional powers has very legitimate interests to be in Asian waters, to be in Southeast Asian waters. I believe I made this point, in one of our interactions as well, Céline, that, if we think about it from the Chinese perspective, is that, China will not and cannot give up its claim anytime soon. So if we believe in that, a position, right? I will also want to believe that China also cannot stop the US and its allies and partners from operating in the South China Sea, at least not without risking war, right? If they attempt to do that, we are looking at war. And experts amongst us would say that, if China go to war over, trying to exclude extra-regional powers from operating in the South China Sea, they are risking war, which experts would say they might not win, and they cannot win. So in my mind, the question, that arise from within the region, less about the Chinese perspective, is, from the Southeast Asian perspective, is that, is one that you've raised as well. Is it sustainable? I think the Admiral gave a very, solid answer in that. I believe the insecurity that, Southeast Asian have, it's one that, whilst extra-regional powers and extra-regional countries have very legitimate reasons to be in regional waters, the timing is one that, has sometimes raised some questions in terms of, why now? Why now when, which of course, we have very good answers to it because of, the Chinese activity in regional waters. So, one question that we do ask sometimes is that, how would, extra-regional powers see itself engaging Southeast Asian countries, engaging local partners? I think that would be very important in terms of, whether or not you get more support, right? Do you see it going it alone, or are you planning to also prop up the current, somewhat limping multilateral mechanisms, right? Actively engaging in existing multilateral institutions, would be a plus in terms of, showing commitment, right? And also, of course, in terms of, the geographical reference, right? Do you still see Southeast Asia as distinct, or is it currently being swept under the broader Indo-Pacific narrative? Right, because that, again, the Indo-Pacific narrative is a rather new one coming from Europe. So in that sense, I think it allows a lot more room in terms of, engaging with, Southeast Asian regional partners, and to clearly demonstrate and clearly share, some of these thinking behind extra-regional powers, current thinking of, increasing more engagement in the region will definitely be helpful in the long run. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jane. I think for your last points, maybe the Admiral Press, you can come back later on and add more comments and response maybe. We have quite a lot of questions already, so I did my best to gather them in a few blocks. So I will now give you the questions, and you'll see some of the questions. Maybe everybody can jump in and give his views on this, and some other are more directed toward one or another. So let's start. We have a series of interesting questions regarding UNCLOS, so the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea and its credibility. Especially regarding the US position vis-à-vis the UNCLOS. Knowing that the US is not part of the UNCLOS, some person raised the issue of the credibility. Can the UNCLOS be credible without the US being part? Or maybe we can reverse also the question: can the US be a credible player without being part to the UNCLOS? I guess. Some other gentlemen raised the question of the legality of the US FONOPS, freedom of navigation operations, also vis-à-vis the UNCLOS. Is it compatible or not? I guess there are different vision of that. And somebody also referred to the recent US FONOPS operation in the India EEZ, saying that it's in violation of UNCLOS. And here we can see also the various maybe interpretation or vision of the UNCLOS. It's raised also the position of India. So do you see this different interpretation practice of UNCLOS undermining the kind of cohesion that can build around the maybe free and open Indo-Pacific, or any kind of a group or coalition to try to actually defend the law of the sea vis-à-vis China? So this will be my first block of question on the credibility of UNCLOS. Then we have several questions on the situation in the South China Sea, and especially the negotiation on the code of conduct. One question by Malcolm Cook, sorry, is about the possibility for ASEAN altogether or any ASEAN member state to withdraw from the negotiation, because obviously there are difference of position between China and ASEAN on this. I will push with another question regarding the possibility for Vietnam to bring the dispute with China into court. We have heard some reports about that, but no move yet. So do you think it's a possibility or not? Actually not feasible, not realistic? And another person raised the danger of the code of conduct that would be actually too China biased. So would it make any sense to get a kind of a weak code of conduct that would be too beneficial to the Chinese interest? This kind of thing. We got another question regarding the RCEP, the recent regional economic agreement, and the way it could modify the term of the dispute in the South China Sea. I don't know if there is a direct relations or not, but still I'm raising the point, as it was also raised in the questions. Regarding the situation in East China Sea now, and maybe more for the ambassador to TSURUOKA, one person asked regarding the main practical risk of what China is doing right now around the Senkak Islands, and especially, do you see the kind of invasion of the Chinese fishermen or any fishermen, landing on the Senkaku Islands and being backed by the China Coast Guard as one of the main threats now that Japan is facing? And this led to another question regarding the reaction by Japan, especially. Do you see Japan changing his military budget allocations to better adapt and adjust to the Chinese the Chinese challenges in the region. And maybe I would add beyond the military budget, maybe the budget dedicated to the Coast Guard as well, which are on the front line. Now, there is one question regarding the French and the European positions, and especially vis-a-vis China. And the question is about the fact that the France and EU would look at China differently in the Indian Ocean as a partner compared to in the South China Sea, where France and then Europe would perceive China more as a kind of a rogue actor. So I don't know, Admiral, if you buy this question altogether, but you can certainly comment on this. Maybe because Admiral, you explained the Chinese strategy about having the several layers from the fishermen to the maritime militia to the Coast Guard and the Navy. There is one question on this. Is it an explicit strategy from China to use this different level, or is it just the fact that they are de facto using that and outside countries just actually explain that well, it seems that there is something going on and there is a kind of strategy by China. So you have a lot on your plates already, so I will leave it for now. So who wants to shoot first on this? Yeah, Jane, okay.
Let me deal with the easy one on COC. Not so easy at all. Hello, Malcolm. It's been a long time. I think Malcolm already know my answer to this, right? First off, I'm definitely not optimistic that we will be able to, conclude the COC anytime soon. But this is not to say that, any of the ASEAN country or ASEAN as a whole will give up on it. I don't think it's even practical or possible. Main reason being that, now ASEAN's ability to manage the South China Sea issue, which includes the negotiation of the COC, is so intertwined to the question of the relevance of ASEAN. It's so intertwined to the question of ASEAN centrality in this part of the world that personally, I don't believe that, Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN countries, can afford to give it up. But there's a more practical issues to this, is that I saw the current, ASEAN-China consultative process as one of the leading platform to engage China on the issue of South China Sea without distracting the agenda in other ASEAN-led platforms. For the longest time, that has been a problem, right? The South China Sea would come out in various different platforms and totally, distract the main agenda at the ARF, at the ADMM, etc., etc. So having this consultative process, I think it's a very neat way, right, to try to ensure that, whilst the South China Sea issue is not resolved or the COC negotiation is not concluded, we do not distract the other agendas, other priorities within Southeast Asia and ASEAN's engagement with extra-regional countries on other pressing issues through the ASEAN-led processes. So sincerely, I hope that any of the ASEAN countries don't give up on this. And this is related to the question Céline asked about Vietnam. I think, I don't have a crystal ball and I don't want to try to predict, because when academics predict, we are always wrong, right? Whether or not Vietnam is going to bring a case against China. And why I say it's related, because, I do want to think that we do need to think about whether if Vietnam do bring a case against China, it will again, disrupt the COC negotiating process. Will China immediately then withdraw and say, hey, let's not do this anymore? Right. So whether or not, I hope this is one consideration as well, when Vietnam is thinking about bringing a case. On the issue of whether, the current negotiation is tilted towards one party or not, as Malcolm alluded to, there are leaked copies of, the draft. Since it is confidential, I will not say whether I saw it or not. But suffice to say that precisely because these are drafts, right? Parties can still negotiate, parties can still agree or, decide that they fully do not agree with the draft. So I think it's a bit too early to tell whether the final product of a COC will indeed be tilted towards one party or not. If I can very quickly, address and share, my 2 cents in some of the other issues that you've raised as well in terms of the different interpretation on UNCLOS. I think, I did, try to address this question in my presentation, so I won't talk to that. But in terms of, Southeast Asia's responses to the various Indo-Pacific strategy and that of, extra-regional powers interests, in that, I take it that, we were referring to the Quad as well. And I think the Southeast Asian response to both is a very interesting one, and is one that we should take note, because I think long story short, right? There's 2 key factors that in my view, Southeast Asian countries are thinking about when they think about the Indo-Pacific strategies and the Quad. One is of course the China factor, right? How China sees and views this initiative. And why that is important is because, the Quad, for example, is now perceived from China as, so much so that it's trying to exclude China from the regional institutions. And that even though, a lot of Southeast Asian countries share the Quad countries' anxiety about China, and still see the US as the leading resident power in the region, I think Southeast Asian countries still need to be very mindful of their robust and very pragmatic relationship that they are painstakingly trying to nurture with China. I think that we have to remember very carefully, right? Singapore's Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, reminded us that Singapore, like the rest of Southeast Asia, and I quote here, live in the intersection of the interests of various major power and must avoid being caught in the middle. I think this is a very common phrase that you will hear, right? We don't want to be caught in the middle or to be forced into invidious choices and quote. And that is, a very common position in Southeast Asia as well. So then what happens when you ask for a response to the various different versions of the Indo-Pacific strategy is that ASEAN came up with its own, right? The ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And, in my mind, this simply tells you that ASEAN or Southeast Asia is simply not confident that China will be understanding. That China will be understanding if any of the Southeast Asian country or ASEAN as a whole, openly support any of this. So it's not so much of, whether or not Southeast Asian countries are confident, of our extra-regional partners, but, less confident with China and worry about the types of blowbacks there will be on Southeast Asia. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jane. So who wants to go? Ambassador Soloka? Sorry.
Thank you. I will just pick the ones I think I could contribute a bit. First, the question of the credibility of UNCLOS. UNCLOS is definitely credible. It has been a product of many years of negotiation and lots of compromises. But at the end of the day, the unique credibility that UNCLOS enjoys is produced by a very comprehensive and thorough dispute settlement mechanism. It asks conflicting partners to talk to each other and resolve the issues peacefully. If it doesn't work, resort to mediation. If that doesn't work, go to an international arbitration. And if there's still dissatisfaction, you can go to ICLOS, International Tribunal Overseas, or even ICJ. It is a very unique convention you find negotiated and agreed by this many countries that includes such a forceful mechanism that is staged to to be available for disputing countries, parties to UNCLOS. And there are a number of precedents that these mechanisms have worked. It is only China that is not following it. One country cannot discredit the global wisdom that is within UNCLOS. Yes, US is not party to it, and I am very critical of that. I've mentioned that many times over when I was in office. If you want to talk about law of the seas, have you join UNCLOS first? Yes, but they could not do it because of the congressional opposition, and this is for seabed mining reason, not other reasons. But they have openly declared that the provisions of UNCLOS are currently have become part of customary international law and binding upon US as well. So you cannot use the non-participation of US to discredit UNCLOS. If you are UNCLOS party, nobody forced you to become one. You have to respect and observe the obligations that are in UNCLOS. It is the same logic that forces all the UNCLOS parties to point out to countries that are violating the UNCLOS regimes and obligations. Being silent means the might will prevail. Has any ASEAN country supported Philippines? These are not at the beginning. Initially, they were shocked that Philippines does this. It's ASEAN mentality. You don't want to stand out. But if the countries that are directly affected don't speak out, who will? And setting bad precedents leads one thing to another. If they can prevail with their violation of UNCLOS obligations in South China Sea, where would they move next? It's the responsibility of the directly affected that makes them more responsible than others to make the point. Yes, you could not do it alone. There is open invitation that others will come. In the war of non-verbal, Céline mentioned earlier, you have many countries that have submitted their official position vis-a-vis UN to counter the argument that historical circumstances give the legitimate rights to China's 9 dotted lines. It has been rejected not just by the arbitration of UNCLOS, but by all the countries that have submitted their views. And there's none that is supporting by a note verbal what the Chinese are saying. But is ASEAN in it? That's another question. If the directly affected ones are not prepared to take their views publicly, then it can be exploited. This is where the participation of the other countries have a deeper meaning than just inclusion of being global. It is the necessary counterbalance against a very large presence that is imposing the status de fait accompli. The issue of landing fishermen on the Senkak Islands. I don't want to see that happen. It will lead to a very serious confrontation if it ever does. There was a collision, intentional collision of Chinese fishing boats to a Japanese ship earlier, about 7 years ago. And that ended in a very pathetic conclusion, releasing the fisherman despite the criminal offense that he committed. That was not even welcomed. It was again criticized as Japan's exercise of jurisdiction. So if there is a landing by a Chinese fisherman, or be it not even Chinese, but any other third country person, without having the legal basis to do that, of course, the Japanese authorities will have to take action on that. but the more importantly, what we are trying to do, and what I think is important, is the prevention that Céline mentioned earlier. We need to prevent the catastrophe, and we can, by making certain what may happen if those actions are taken. And if the opponents still persist and insist in doing it, then the global community will have to stand up. Alone, you are limited in what you can do, but voices make a difference. On the arbitration award, for example,
excuse me,
Chinese
Ambassador, I'm so sorry to interrupt you because we already run behind schedule. So
I know.
So if you
but
can
just one word,
one word, and then I'll give the floor to
narrative is common in Chinese statement. They are complying with international law. They say it repeatedly. So are we.
Okay, very good. Thanks a lot, Admiral Pazuk. Sorry for being late, and now you have the last words for you.
Yes, I will be very rapid and answer two questions. The multi-layered strategy, is it explicit or implicit? It is implicit, but it's in the mechanism of a multi-layered gray zone operation to be implicit. Each layer is supposed to be independent from the other one. If you don't have this mechanism, if you don't have this pretended independence, then there is no more multi-layered gray zone operation. So it's in the efficiency of the strategy. The second thing is the discrepancies between the posture of the Chinese Navy, depending on the places in the world, Indian Ocean or China Sea. And I would say the closer, the harder, the further, the smoother. And when we operate in South China Sea, East China Sea, or Yellow Sea, we have a totally different posture from the Chinese units as the one that we work with in the Indian Ocean. Although the tools are the same, there is an enormous fishing fleet of Oman in the northern Indian Ocean. There is a huge commercial fleet working there, oceanographic operations by Chinese scientific ships, and since the fight against piracy in the Gulf of Aden, a constant, permanent Chinese fleet in this northern Indian Ocean. There, the cooperation is, or the encounters are smoother, and they are even smoother when you go in the Med and when you go in the Atlantic. So there is a real contrast between the attitude of the Chinese units at sea.
Excellent. Would you like to say a few additional words on the European presence in the region?
Yes, well, UK, Germany has announced that they will deploy units there, and they are a very regular partners. So we will probably exchange with the different navies, either on the timing of the deployments, on our own experience, but Western Pacific is far from Europe, and there is not only the difficulty of operating there, but also to have a logistic support, to have bases or ports where you can have this logistic support and technical support, which is a part of the problem. And this is why we send regularly ships and rely on our partners for port visit, for crew exchanges and exercises. We don't hear you, Céline.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. So thanks a lot for your patience. I'm sorry to be behind schedule. I think it's only demonstrating the the importance and the very rich nature of the topic discussed this morning. As Ambassador said, we could spend hours on each details actually on our discussion. So we need to reconvene. I hope maybe next time in Paris to continue the discussion. For this morning, I would like to thank a lot our excellent speakers and thanks the audience and the numerous questions that we got. And so with that, I would like to stop the webinar, and I wish you a very good day or evening or afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.